Hi, everybody. My name is Max Tsai. I'm a housing attorney at the Housing Justice Center. We're a nonprofit. I'll kind of give the spiel when I get to the slide. And I'm presenting today with Larry, and thanks again to Ben Werner from the Eastside Freedom Library for inviting me and Larry to come and speak today. Really happy to be here. I'm going to start the presentation with just a couple of things about the end of Rent Help MN, which is the big rental assistance program from the state. And as you guys, as folks probably are aware of, the program ended on January 28th, ended quite abruptly. There was about 3 days advance notice that they weren't accepting applications anymore. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means and what folks can do now after the program has ended. And then Larry will give a more general update on the state of housing law in this as it stands right now. So can everybody see my PowerPoint? And is it okay if I go ahead and get started, Ben? Okay, awesome. So again, Larry and I both work at the Housing Justice Center. We're a nonprofit public advocacy, and we are a team of lawyers. We work to preserve, protect, expand affordable housing. So we do both policy work and some individual tenant actions if they kind of turn into building-wide litigation. We also we do have an organizing component. So we'll also work with buildings if they're interested in forming, a tenant organization or, asserting their rights in other ways as well. So you can contact us at that number, 612-807-1139. We have a few different options, but if you just have a general question about rent help, or if you have a question about something that's going on through Landlord, I would start with that number. You can also shoot us an email at info@hjcmn.org. Okay, it's just me presenting, so this is the same PowerPoint. There might be folks who have seen the Homeline webinar from about a week ago, where I presented with Shana Temenez, who's another attorney in our office. But here's our contact information one more time, and then there's my personal email on the screen as well. Okay, so my part of the talk, and I'll try to go as fast as I can through it because it can get a little bit lengthy. But here's just kind of a rundown. So I'll talk about the end of rent help. I'll talk about how folks who have an application in can check their status. I'll talk about pre-qualification letters, which is the way that you prove to a court or your landlord or anybody who's asking that you have something in Rent Help MN. I'll talk about some common things that might be missing from people's applications, especially if you applied right before the deadline. I'll talk about appeals, or basically I'll just talk generally about what to do if you're denied from rent help after the program's ended. I'll do a couple of FAQs, and then I'll leave time for Q&A after Larry's done talking as well. Okay, so rent help basics. So I just want to go through some of the just general eligibility information. So you had to be eligible at the time that you applied to receive assistance. And I'm going over some of the basic eligibility because there might be folks who got, applications in right before the deadline. And I just want people to be prepared in case they weren't eligible when they applied, to not, count on that application going through, not kind of rely on that income or that assistance ahead of time. Oh, and one thing I forgot to give for my spiel is that so Housing Justice Center, our role in Rent Help MN, we're not the state, we don't process applications. And we were a field partner with Rent Help MN, with the state's program until January 31st. We're no longer a field partner, so we don't have the most up-to-date information, so things may have changed in the last week. But this is just from our experience from being a field partner for almost a year. And this is the information that we have to the best of our knowledge. So we're just speaking from our experience as recently departed field partner. So the basics for rent help is that you had to be a low-income Minnesota renter. They used a statistic to measure that called area median income. I'll talk about that in a little bit. You also could be eligible in one of two ways. You were either getting or eligible for unemployment benefits, or you basically had some sort of negative impact due to COVID-19, which is a lot of folks. And then you also had to demonstrate a risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability. Being behind on rent was enough to qualify for that. So low income was 80% of area median income. I use Ramsey County as an example. So if you're a one-person household, that was 55,000, and up to a four-person household, 79,900. So it's higher than a lot of other benefits that people may apply for. But that being said, if you were higher than the income limits that are set out there, then you'll likely be denied. There was documentation required. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then you had to have an eligible type of rental property, but it's almost everything that fits under the general rule of, do I pay somebody for the right to live where I live? So, apartments, of course, single family homes if they're rented, rented manufactured homes. A lot of times lot rent was the thing that people were applying for rent help for. Hotels, motels, and other informal lease agreements subject to review by the program. But if you're not paying somebody just for the privilege of living where you were, that's not a thing that's covered. And the most common thing is, if I have a mortgage, so technically, the bank has an interest in my house, but that was not something that was covered by rent help. So applying for a mortgage, your application would likely be denied. And then it gets really messy if you're doing some sort of contract for deed thing. So that would kind of depend on the individual circumstance. But that may or may not, depending on how the arrangement is. And there's some federal guidance and state guidance for that as well. So you were covered up to 18 months. So if you applied for over 18 months, you're likely to have at least that portion of your rent and or utilities not covered by your application. And then your costs, and you could only apply if you had back rent due at the time of application. If you only had utilities due, or you only had you wanted to just apply for rent in the future, which would have been rent for February, March, April, etc., then you're likely to be denied. So you had to have owed your landlord rent in at least January or earlier. So if you put in an application and you only applied for February on, unfortunately, your application is not likely to go all the way through. And that's just the way they decided to do it there. Okay. So that's kind of the general eligibility stuff for rent help that I wanted to cover. The next thing is, how do I check the status of my application? So, if you're somebody who put in an application before 9 p.m., January 28th, you may have been in a rush and you might not know how to check your status. Well, here are a couple of the easiest ways. The first one is to call 211. 211 is the service available through United Way. They have a special rent helpline. And what you would do is you would give your information. If you know your application number, you might give that, and they can give you a status update there. Even easier than calling 211, because 211 can have some long holds, maybe less so now because the program's closed, but nonetheless, it can be pretty hit or miss depending on who you get at 211. Logging into your dashboard, I'll explain in a little bit some troubleshooting if you're somebody who's forgotten their login or their password, but that's probably the easiest way to check your status is to log into your online dashboard. If you're a landlord, and this goes for not just status checks, but for any question that you may have, you can email landlords@renthelpmn.org. And then if your application is connected to what's called a field partner, you can always ask your field partner for a status update. We used to be able to do status checks up until the end of January, and every field partner should be able to do a status check. One thing that you can do is you can call 211 and you can, and this is the language I would use, you can ask to have your application connected to a field partner. So what that does is that allows a field partner, which is a can be a CAP agency, can be a nonprofit like us, basically a local organization, and it'll put your application on their dashboard. It'll let them see notes, it'll let them see updates, and it'll most importantly let them check your status for you. So if your application is connected to a field partner, you can always call your field partner, ask them for a status update. Okay, what if I applied but I don't know my username or password? This is really common. And here are a couple of common scenarios. The first one's pretty obvious. I applied online, but it's been a few months, life happens. I don't know my username or password. That's a reason to use the password and username recovery that I'm going to go over. The second one is I applied over the phone. Oftentimes you'll be connected with a field partner, or 211 may walk you through part of it. Somebody filled in my application for me online, but I either forgot or my username or password, or they forgot to tell me my username or password. And either way, I didn't write down my username or password. In that case, you would still just use the username and password recovery. The last one is something that a lot of people don't know, is that if you applied using a paper application, you can still use the online username and password recovery tool, because for every paper application, there should be an online application created that should be basically a duplicate of that paper application. It should be the online version of that paper application, and it'll be processed the same way an online application would be processed. So somebody will manually enter it in. That's why if you have a paper application, you can still check your status online by using the username and password recovery. Okay, so the username and password recovery is you go to apply.renthelpmn.org/login. That's the fastest way to do it. You can do it from the main page, but this is the fastest way to do it. You will either need the email or the phone number that was used on the application. If you don't have one of those things, you'll need to call 211 and ask them to either change your application, you'll have to ask them to change the email that they use for your application, or change the phone number that they use for your application. A common thing is like somebody will use like a burner email that they don't actually, or somebody will make up something in the email, or somebody's phone no longer works for whatever reason. That's something you'd have to call 211. You'd have to call the United Way helpline to be able to fix that. But if you have the same email, you have the same phone number that you applied with, this is a really easy way to find your status, to be able to log in. You just click forgot username, you enter in your email or your phone, they'll send you a code, and then with that code, you'll be able to see your username. And then you do the same thing, you click on forgot password at apply.renthelpmn.org/login. Then you, again, send it to your phone or your email. Then you request a password reset, and then you enter in a new password. Now, the confusing thing is, a password has to be at least 15 characters. So if you think your password is something, but it's less than 15 characters, you don't know your password, go ahead and use the forgot password tool. Okay, once you log in, you'll see what's called the renter dashboard. This is why being able to log into your dashboard is so important. On the left, you'll see your application number. In the middle, you'll see your application status. And on the right, you'll be able to access something called a pre-qualification letter. Now, this blue button I have on the screen says begin application, just because there wasn't a good way to do a screenshot of the completed one without redacting a bunch of stuff. But basically, that button should actually say pre-qualification letter if you've actually handed in a Rent Help MN application. Okay, so this is really important. What is a pending status? Larry, I think, will cover a little bit more of what's left of the off-ramp that folks might know about. But basically, a pending status is something that protects you from one type of eviction. It protects you from non-payment of rent. So you cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent if you have a pending Rent Help MN status. A pending status is a status that is still being processed by Minnesota Housing. So some examples of pending statuses are pending initial review, requires applicant response, declined by landlord, which is a really confusing one because it has the word declined in it. That just means your landlord doesn't want to do rent help, but your application should still be live. Now, we've seen some things where they mess that up and people get rejected, but in theory, it should move on to something called direct applicant pay. And basically, you should be able to keep going without your landlord. So it says declined by landlord, but if you see that status, don't be scared. You should still have protected status. Appeals, we'll talk about a little bit, which is something that you can do if you're denied. If you have an appeal pending, that's still a pending status. And finally, something called final review, which is not the last step in the rental process, which is kind of confusing. But basically, if you're in final review, you're still being processed, so you're still okay. And then things that are not pending statuses are declined by program, declined by renter, withdrawn. If you see any of these, immediately call 211, or you can give us a ring. These are examples of not pending statuses. These are ones where if you are denied and you're behind on rent, you can be evicted for non-payment of rent by your landlord. Okay, so the big thing that happened, because they only gave 3 days for the deadline, is that a lot of applications were sent in without documents that they need to be able to process the applications. Really common ones are a rent ledger. A rent ledger is something that breaks down what you owe by the month. So it'll say like January 2022, I owed $1,000. December 2021, I owed 1,200. November 2021, I owed 1,200. Worst version, but something that you should still submit if it's the only thing that you have, is I owe, say $3,000 as of January 28th. What they prefer is something that breaks everything down by the month, like I just described. But if you only have something that says how much you owe in total, that's fine. Some other common things that you should prepare if you didn't submit it with your initial application is a rental agreement, so a lease for most cases, but you can use other things in the place of that, a utility bill. And if you don't have any of these, you should start preparing what's called self-verification forms. These are all available at renthelpmn.org/resources. And if any of this is confusing, you can of course call 211, or you can call us at Housing Justice Center, and we're happy to walk you through it. Okay, self-verification form looks like this. Since we're a little bit short on time, I won't go through the entire form, but basically you can self-certify to almost everything on the application. You can self-certify that you owe rent. You can self-certify that you're a renter. You can self-certify that you don't make any income. You can self-certify if you don't have a driver's license, or if you don't have a passport, if you don't have other government issued ID to prove that you are the person applying, you can self-certify for that. And you can self-certify that the person if somebody is added to the lease that wasn't initially on the lease, you can self-certify that your lease has changed since you've moved in. Here are a couple examples of the form. And then here's an example of the pre-qualification letter. So again, you would click this blue button, you would get this pre-qualification letter. It would say today's date, it would say an application number. This is redacted because this is somebody's real pre-qualification letter. But basically, this is the letter that you would show to a judge, your landlord, to anybody who's asking, and it'll say your status, it'll say when you applied, it'll say how much you applied for, and then it has legal language that says that you can't, that a landlord can't file or proceed with an eviction action for non-payment of rent against a tenant if they have a pending application. Okay, briefly, off-ramp protections. Final protections end on June 1st, 2022. That continues even though the program's closed. So even though the program's not accepting any applications, if you have an application that's being processed, you're still protected under the off-ramp. So that's really important to know. Until they stop processing all applications, there are people that can still be protected under the off-ramp. And if you've submitted an application before January 28th and you haven't heard anything, you may be somebody who's protected under the off-ramp. So don't think because the program's over, that means that you're not protected by the off-ramp. You still might be protected by the off-ramp. Okay, if you're denied, most denials come via email. Make sure to check the email that you applied with. The most common reasons that people are denied were for lack of communication or not submitting the documents. We went over some of the most common documents that are missing from people's applications. Appeals can't be done online. They can only be done by mail or fax. You don't have to do a specific appeal form. You just have to send Rent Help a letter. The appeal has to be sent within 10 days. Within 10 days, the safest thing is to submit 10 days within when you notice that your status changed to something like denied by the program. But technically, if you receive a letter or an email at a later point, you can send it from 10 days when you got that letter. A pending appeal is a pending application under the off-ramp. So even though you have something that says denied by program, if you have sent in an appeal, make sure you tell your landlord, the court, anybody who may ask that you have an appeal and that you should still have a pending status because you did send in an appeal, even if it hasn't updated yet, because it takes some time for them to go through all their mail or all their faxes. That's the lag between the time an appeal was sent and when the status is reflected in somebody's dashboard. Appeals can be very confusing though. So contact a field partner if you're working with a field partner. You can also contact 211, and you can always contact us at the Housing Justice Center. If we can't help you, we'll try to find you somebody that can. And we can definitely help if you want to do an appeal for rent help, even though we're not field partners anymore. Frequently asked questions. Okay, I apply by the deadline. Will Rent Help MN run out of money before my application is processed? Based on what we've heard for now, that's really unlikely. They closed because they want to pay everybody who applied by the deadline. Does my landlord have to participate? No. So even if your landlord's holding things up, it might take a little bit longer, but just because your landlord doesn't want to do it doesn't mean you can't get rent help. And we've had people still get rent help, even if their landlords say, I don't want to deal with rent help, I hate rent help, etc. If you move before you're approved, you'll be denied. You won't have an opportunity to reapply for rent help. That being said, you still might want to talk to us or talk to your field partner or 211 to talk to you a little bit more about your options there before you decide not to move just because of rent help. Finally, you can apply for 18 months again. And then can your landlord evict you after assistance? Landlords can't evict tenants for, again, specifically one thing, non-payment of rent while a rental assistance application is pending. But even if it's pending, you can still be evicted for what's called other material breach reasons, which include things like criminal activity or staying past the end of your lease. How do you check the status? We went over that earlier. And then does the landlord or tenant get a letter when they reach funding approved? No, but you should get a letter after your payment is sent. The payment should show how many months you requested and how many months Minnesota Housing paid for you. All right, that's our number, 612-807-1139. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Larry, but happy to answer some questions after that.
Okay, nice job, Max. Max has just been steeped in all this stuff. Some of this probably sounds like bureaucratic catch-22 stuff. For those of you that haven't read Catch-22, and if Peter, you don't have it in the library, it needs to be in the library. It's a really good book. But Max knows this stuff top to bottom, as does his colleague, our colleague Shayna. So definitely reach out to us if you have some problems with it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to go through a slideshow. Let me just kind of work with some settings here on my, yeah. Okay, no, let's change that. There we go. Okay, so I've got a slideshow here. It's about what tenants and landlords need to know about the Minnesota eviction transition. It's about 35 or so slides. Some of the stuff I'm going to go through very quickly, but I'm also going to show you where you can find this slideshow and look at it later if you want to go more detail. So I'm going to go there right now. This is a web page that I maintain for courses I teach at the University of Minnesota Law School. And so the way you would find this, my name is Larry McDonough. If you Googled my name in either housing or poverty law, you'd probably find this website pretty fast. If you ended up on the homepage for the website, all you have to do is go down the left side to housing. And this has a number of different items there about landlord-tenant law. Now, a lot of this is geared toward law students and attorneys, but you don't have to be a law student and attorney to get something out of this stuff. Now where I have tonight's slideshow is on this pandemic eviction and other housing law and rules link. And there's a lot of stuff on this page as well, and a lot of it's geared toward attorneys. But if you go down here and you select tenants and landlords, it'll take you down to this, and this is what we're doing tonight. Some other useful things on this website for tenants is I'm going to back up to the main housing page, is this resources link here. And it has some good websites for doing research. If you have some, if you want to go to some websites and find out if your landlord's registered with the Secretary of State, or if you're in Minneapolis and you want to find out if your landlord has a rental license, there are a number of good links there. And then also on this client referrals one, this is a good one for looking up for legal help in all kinds of different areas. So let's say you had some disability benefits and you wanted to talk to an attorney about that. I've got information on attorneys that do that kind of work. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow now. This is who I am. Of course, my bio is a pack of lies, but read it. If you think there's something relevant there. I've been doing this for quite a while. Since back in July, and I had a previous set of slides that I did for the previous year when the rules were a little bit different. So I've been doing this for a while, but I do shift it around for different audiences and for things that are new. So I've already talked a little bit about resources. I'll say just a little bit more about those. I'll talk about the transition law, a little bit about the CDC, and then I'll talk about mostly what I'm going to talk about is kind of evictions. Let's go back up there. I'll talk mostly about defending evictions in the phase that we're in right now, or if you're a landlord doing evictions. But some background here I think is helpful. Again, resources, I have a lot on my website. Homeline has a good website. Law Help Minnesota is I really like this website. I helped work on building this when I was at Legal Aid, and it's got a lot of nice short pieces that talk about a variety of different topics. Some of them are landlord tenant, like what are the rules for security deposits, but other things, other areas like government benefits, child support guidelines, all that kind of stuff. So good websites here. Okay, the transition law, it's got a long name because it was passed during the special session last summer. And whenever you see a link on this, if you went to my website and looked at the slideshow, pulled it up and selected any of these links, it would take you to the source information. So we have this eviction transition law. It got rid of the executive orders back in June 30, 2021. To be honest, I wasn't really happy with that being the time to pull the plug on those executive orders, because as you'll see in a moment, they were very protective of tenants and in a time period when the pandemic was pretty fired up. And guess what? The pandemic's pretty fired up right now. And in the time, when this passed, it's hard to remember back so far, but infections were about 100 a day in June, and deaths were about 5 a day, sometimes 0. And I know the numbers are going down now, but I was on a public radio show today, and part of the thing I was saying there is that the numbers are going down, but they're still really bad. And we don't have many of the protections in place that we had back under the executive orders. Now, the CDC was a player in this area. It didn't have a big impact in Minnesota because we had more protective laws here, but the Supreme Court, I think, wrongly invalidated it this summer. So it's not a thing anymore. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk to you about where things were at before October. October was the start of the current phase that we're in. So we had an executive order 2079 that was in play from March of 2020 through June 30 of 2021. And it didn't allow any evictions for non-payment of rent, and for the most part limited evictions to what I would call ones with the nastier allegations. Serious endangerment, drug violation of 504B171, which is drugs, prostitution, firearms, domestic abuse, harassment, and significantly damaging property were the main things, and non-payment of rent wasn't available as a claim. And the vast, vast majority of eviction cases are non-payment of rent. So it basically clamped down on quite a few of them. Okay, the transition law went into effect at the end of June, and I highlight with these slides coming up what was added at each phase. Okay, so what was added here is this italicized portion that landlords could file evictions for non-payment of, well, actually, I should have italicized a little bit more. What it opened up is this non-payment of rent with a 15-day written notice, but it was still very limited to people that were eligible for Rent Help Minnesota, but refused to apply. And it specifically said that landlords couldn't file non-payment of rent eviction cases if a tenant had a pending application. Okay, so that's essentially what was mostly different. And this opened up some non-payment of rent cases, but not a lot, because a lot of people that were eligible were trying to apply, and people that weren't eligible for rent assistance, landlords couldn't file eviction cases against them yet. So on July 14, another category opened up, and these were eviction cases where the tenant was committing a material lease violation. So material lease violation is essentially it's broader than serious endangerment and 504B171 and significant damage to property. It opened up into other categories of what I would call big reasons for evictions. Not every violation of a lease is evictable. Now, some landlords think that, and they might even put that in their lease, but courts are the ones to decide, is it material enough to evict? And so I'd say an example would be if you're having loud parties and they're so bad that the police are coming and you're getting cited and the neighbors are threatening to leave, even though you haven't hurt anybody and haven't broke anything, that probably would be material. On the other hand, if you have, a few people staying over past quiet hours and the really sensitive neighbor complains and the police come out and they say this is nothing and nobody's threatened to leave, I'd say that's not material. So that's what opened up. But still, not a lot was open in the non-payment of rent area. So on September 12, what opened up were non-payment of rent cases for tenants that weren't eligible for state emergency assistance, state emergency rental assistance. So that opened it up a little bit more, but there were still a lot that weren't open at that point. For instance, if a landlord just didn't want to renew a lease when it expired, the landlord could only evict if the landlord could fit into these categories here. In pre-pandemic, a landlord could simply say, I just don't want to renew it. Okay. So what opened up on October 12 is mostly back to pre-pandemic. Okay. So, but the exception was the different types of like the 15-day notice for non-payment of rent cases, that ended. It expanded non-payment of rent cases with the exception that landlords couldn't file eviction cases if the tenant had a pending state emergency rental assistance application. So as opposed to what I'd said on the last slide, this means that now landlords could terminate a month-to-month lease or not renew leases without giving any reason. Before they had to give a reason, but now they wouldn't have to give a reason. But the caveat is as long as they're not retaliating against the tenants for enforcing their rights, and that would include enforcing the right to seek emergency rental assistance. So I'll talk about that retaliation thing in a few minutes. So again, through June 1, 2022, landlords can't file eviction cases for non-payment of rent against tenants with pending applications. But that's not a get out of jail free card for those of you that are Monopoly fans. I'm still kind of amazed that Monopoly is around, but it is. So if you engage in a material lease violation, even though you have a pending application, a landlord could evict you for that material lease violation, but not for owing rent. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how evictions work. And I'm just going to keep an eye on my time here so that, because I want to make sure we have time for questions here. So I think I will try to get done about quarter of, which gives me about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to go through some of this stuff fast, but you can go back and look at this stuff if you go to my website, and I'll show you again when we get done how to find it. Okay, so evictions, there are certain types of notices that some landlords have to give before filing eviction cases. Now, through October 12, the landlord had to give a notice, this should say a 15-day notice for non-payment of rent cases, but that ended on October 12. So landlords, most landlords don't have to give a notice for a non-payment of rent case. But the second bullet point here, there's a federal law called the CARES Act. You might have heard about it in the summer of 2020. There's a provision of it that's still in force, and that requires landlords of covered properties to give a 30-day notice before filing an eviction case. Covered properties are public and subsidized housing properties. If you're in those properties, you probably know that you are in public or subsidized housing. But the thing that's less clear to people are federally backed mortgages, okay? So I'm here in my living room here, and I own my house with my wife. I'm not a landlord, so it doesn't matter if I'm would be a covered property. But I don't know if my mortgage is federally backed. It's been bought and sold a few times. If I were a landlord, I'd need to go figure it out if it was federally backed. And if you're a tenant and you're getting eviction from a landlord, you want to try to figure out if you have a federally backed mortgage. Now, attorneys can help you figure that out. I've got some links here from a manual that I have and it has other links in there about how to figure out if you're in one of those properties. Now, manufactured home parks have various notice requirements. If you're a tenant in property and it's a post-mortgage foreclosure or contract for deed cancellation, there's some notice requirements there. Some cities have notice requirements. So for instance, Minneapolis has a 14-day notice requirement for non-payment of rent cases. And some leases have their notice requirements. And so not all cases require a notice before filing, but some do. The complaint has to have details about the eviction. If the landlord simply says, I want you to move and you didn't, that might not be enough. The complaint form also has to have information about that the landlord gave the tenant contact information for the landlord for street addresses and things. And if the landlord doesn't do that, that might be a defense to the eviction case. There are some complicated rules for the landlord delivering the court papers to the tenant. And if you receive the court papers personally from someone that you don't know, they hand them to you, it probably was done okay. But if the court papers were handed to somebody else to give to you, or if they were mailed in posting, sometimes landlords get that wrong, and an attorney can help you figure out by looking at your court file and seeing if they did it the right way or not. There's a thing called an expedited eviction. It doesn't really move cases that much faster. So if any of you guys are landlords, I would say it's not really a great deal for you, because the delivery of the court papers has to occur within 24 hours of when the case is filed, and that's not a lot of time. The person who serves the court papers, is not supposed to be involved in the case. It can be an attorney or a process server, but it's not supposed to be someone involved with managing the property. These cases move pretty fast. They're scheduled within 7 to 14 days from filing. Expedited cases just a little bit faster, but the courts can schedule out further if they need to. They have the authority to do that. When a court schedules a case, it's like a first hearing in a case, and usually nothing bad happens if the tenant shows up and says, I want to contest it. And then the court then schedules another hearing. They're supposed to do it within 6 days, but again, the courts can relax those deadlines. The tenant doesn't have to have a written answer. The tenant can show up with or without an attorney and respond to the landlord's complaint orally. If you do a written answer, if you want to file a written document, there's a filing fee for that, around $300, but you can get that waived by filing what's called an informa pauperis or an IFP application, and attorneys know exactly how to do that. I'm gonna just say here that cases can be kind of complicated, and so there are rules of evidence and civil procedure that govern these cases. And so if you're doing it on your own, either a landlord or a tenant, it's good at a minimum to get some advice from an attorney on how to navigate that. Like some people say, can I have somebody write a letter and can I have that submit that? And for the most part, no. You have to have witnesses show up. You just can't have them write something and then bring it to court. There's certain preconditions that landlords have to do besides some of the notices I talked about earlier. If they have someone represent them who's not an attorney, this will be a power of authority in the file. If they have a business name that's not a personal name, like if mine was LM Properties, if it's not my name, I have to register it with the Secretary of State. And if they don't do that, that can lead to a defense for a tenant as well. There are a lot of defenses to non-payment of rent cases. These are the most common cases. And just because you owe rent doesn't mean it's a loser if you're a tenant. Now, we talked a little bit earlier, if you have a pending application for Rent Help Minnesota, a landlord cannot evict you for non-payment of rent. but we already talked a little bit about some of the notices earlier. And if you pulled up the slide on your computer and just clicked on slide 13, it would take you right back there. But you can see there are defenses related to how the property is maintained, rental licenses, utilities, late fees, receiving part payments of rent, retaliation. And even if the tenant owes rent, this thing redemption, the court has the ability to give the tenant time to pay rent, but the tenant does have to pay by that deadline or the court will proceed with eviction. Okay, I think I'm maybe gonna go till, I'll go to 750 just because I want to get through a little bit more of this, but I will clamp it off at 750. Okay, there are types of cases. I mentioned earlier that landlords can, if you have a month-to-month tenancy, now a landlord can end that with no reason, but they have to give a 1-month written notice received before the rent is due to be effective at the end of the next month. And if there's no rent being charged at all, which you might think is kind of weird, but that does happen now and then, it's actually a 3-month notice. Retaliation is probably the defense that we see the most often is retaliation. So a classic case of that is I get the housing inspector out, housing inspector says, landlord, fix something. Landlord gives me a 1-month notice to move out. I can claim that that notice is retaliatory. And if the court agrees with me, it invalidates the notice. And where what I'm concerned about right now is there might be retaliation for participating in rent help. Like tenant applies for rent help, the landlord's been kind of crabby about it because it hasn't gone fast, and I get that they're crabby about it, okay? So landlord's crabby about it, and then on October 12th, when it was okay to give a 1-month notice, landlord gives a 1-month notice, they don't give any reason, and if it's within 90 days of when I was still working on, talking to the landlord about my rent help application, then there might be a presumption of retaliation. And I would say, I think you're retaliating against me for applying for rent help. And if the landlord says, well, no, I was actually gave you this notice because you're behind on the rent, then that goes up against that prohibition of evicting for non-payment of rent if you have a pending application. So again, if you think that's going on, talk to attorney. And at the end of this slideshow, I've got places you can contact. There are a lot of different defenses to breach of lease. So if the landlord says it's a material breach, and some of the defenses are, well, it's not a material breach, or the landlord didn't have a clause that allowed her to evict me for a material breach. Landlords can waive lease violations by failing to evict earlier. Landlords can waive lease provisions themselves by failing to enforce them. Landlords have to accommodate tenants' disabilities. Landlords can't penalize the tenant for calling the police. The tenant's a victim of domestic violence. There are special protections there. And again, retaliation is a no-no. There are different rules for mobile home parks and public housing, but even where a tenant has breached the lease, the court does have the ability to use what we call an equitable power and say, I'm not going to evict you if it looks like the landlord's rights are protected and it looks like it would be a great injustice. The remedies, the court can evict a tenant or not evict a tenant based on how the court analyzes the things we've just discussed. In a non-payment of rent case, if the tenant wins, the court could reduce the rent for habitability violations or utility violations, could remove illegal charges from the ledger, and again, give the tenant some time to pay. Tenants who lose can ask for 7 days to pay. And I'm going to keep moving here because we're getting close to 750. Now, Max talked about financial assistance. He talked about the Rent Help Minnesota program, and so I'm not going to duplicate that. There are some other programs for rental assistance, including in Dakota and Hennepin and Ramsey counties. Landlords can apply for rental assistance, and the tenant can cooperate with that. But there are other types of rental assistance out there, things called like emergency assistance. Now, emergency assistance isn't going to pay like a year's worth of rent, but it might help a tenant pay a month or two's rent. And even more importantly, it might help a tenant pay a deposit and a first month's rent on a new place. If you're looking for housing, Housing Link is a really great resource. One of my daughters used that when she was looking for housing. You can put a lot of parameters in there, and you can call them if you're not computer savvy. There are mediation programs out there that help people, landlords and tenants, get together and work things out. There's one place you can contact, communitymediation.org, and it can find the mediation program that's closest to you. There are legal aid programs around the state, and they're really, if you're low income, those would be the places to contact first. They're set geographically. So like in Hennepin County, it would be Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid or Central Minnesota Legal Services. If you're in Ramsey County, it'd be Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services. And their websites tell you where they are organized. There also is, you can get advice kind of regardless of where you live, online advice or hotline phone advice. So those are some of those places. And there are other organizations like where Max and I work that do more systemic work, like we do large cases and we do lobbying at the municipal and the state level. If you have opinions on what's going on, so like for instance, obviously enough, I do. I think we have evictions opened up way too fast given where we are in the pandemic. And there's a legislative session going on right now. So if you feel like that, or if you disagree, either way, make your voice heard. I've got links here for various levels of Minnesota government. You can look up your Minnesota senator or House of Representatives. Local governments can have some activity here as well. The courts can, and on the national level, I probably wouldn't waste too much time on the national level, given the division of the Senate and the House there, but make your voice heard. And again, here's my contact information, and feel free to reach out to Max or me either right now or later if you have some things you want to discuss.
Thank you so much, Max and Larry. I want to open up for some questions. I have some, but I want to make sure other folks have a chance to ask some questions too. Okay, I'll go ahead with one of my questions. So, a lot of the program of Rent Help Minnesota was focused on assisting tenants in having to pay back their landlord. Aside from PPP loans, Larry, you briefly touched on like the applications took a really long time to process. What was the position landlords were in during this time?
Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, no, Ben, can you clarify a little bit?
Yeah, so this program came about to assist renters, and
it's really good for landlords because essentially, it's money that they likely would not have gotten paid if not for rental assistance. So, almost all of the payments went directly to landlords. There's the rare instance that it was directly paid for tenants. And I just want to, again, remind folks that if your landlord doesn't want to participate, doesn't mean you can't get rental assistance. Now, of course, it's a good deal for, it's a great program for tenants, because being housed is so important, of course, and being stably housed even more so. So it let people stay, especially in a pandemic, especially, through much of this winter, etc. But it's still a great deal for landlords. It's money that they're getting from the state for many, many months, sometimes, $20,000, $30,000. And it's money that they might not have otherwise have been able, because also re-renting was really difficult during a portion of the pandemic, and there's obviously a lot of back rent that's part of the program as well.
And I agree. I mean, again, emergency assistance is what all we would have had without this program, and it has to look at what's the most economical way to solve the emergency. And so if paying a deposit in a first month's rent is a lot cheaper than paying a year's worth of rent, year's worth of rent is never going to get paid by emergency assistance. So this was a good program for landlords. At the same time, I get why they were grumpy about it didn't go very fast, and it should have gone a lot faster. I've been a landlord at different times in my life. I'm not right now. And when I did, I was just renting out a single unit, and that would have been hard. And I think it was hard for smaller landlords. I think for the larger landlords, I think they were a little more insulated from that.
I guess I think it's really interesting that the landlords were being paid pretty well with this program, and yet the assistance was still pulled really early. And that's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, like what happened there. Peter?
I wonder, you guys have given us quite a in-depth micro look at how this all works. And I want to step back and take a more macro look. And we started the housing justice program at the Eastside Freedom Library because of our awareness of the disparities in home ownership between white people and people of color. And I wonder, and we learned right away that Minnesota has some of the worst disparities in the country. How does Minnesota's behavior towards renters during the pandemic compare with what other states are doing? And you guys may be so in the weeds that you don't have time to really look at what's happening in California or New York or Michigan or, God forbid, Florida or Texas. But what is your sense of how Minnesota stacks up in how we've responded to this crisis that renters have experienced during the pandemic?
We actually stack up pretty well. And one of the things I think I'll show you right now is I actually did a lot of, let's see if I find the right thing here. So yeah, so I did a lot of analysis of what was going around in the country. And I'm going to pull up something pretty fast here. And I've also got Max's slides up here. If you went to Rent Help Minnesota there, you'd find that. But what I'm going to do is pull open this manual that I have that talk about the weeds. This is really in the weeds. But what I want to get at here is kind of health impact of evictions during the pandemic. And some researchers from around the country did some analysis of what was going on in the summer of 2020. And so here's some analysis of what was going on when we had evictions suspended in Minnesota under that executive order. And here are other states that had it suspended either part of the time or less of the time, with populations very close to ours. And column D here is, column E here are the deaths that were estimated to be attributed to having evictions more open at a time when they needed to be more closed. And so you can see we didn't have our evictions very open. And so states with different populations or similar populations to us, they had a lot of estimated deaths that were related to. And the argument here is that you evict one household, it coalesces with somebody somewhere. And it might be under a tent, in a shelter, under a bridge or whatever, or doubled up, okay? And so now South Carolina had a lot more infections going on in that time period. So that's why they have a bigger number. Now, another study here looked at how many lives were probably saved, again, in the summer of 2020 because of eviction protections, okay? And in Minnesota, again, our numbers weren't very bad in the summer, but still 680 lives and 22,000 infections is a big deal. Now, I took all this data and I extrapolated out to our more contagious and deadly time in the fall. And so what I concluded is that from March of 2020 through December of 2020, our eviction protections saved 2,000 lives and over 100,000 infections. So we were on the very good side of that period from March of 2020, I would say, until June of 2021. I'd say now, not so much, right? Because now things are pretty open here and we got a pretty aggressive pandemic going on right now. Now, in terms of Rent Help Minnesota, I've heard that our state's done a better job than some states of getting the money out. still not great. And finally, to get at your kind of underlying point, I've been looking at a lot of economic data. The census has been doing surveys of households throughout the pandemic. And we've seen unemployment rates among tenants holding pretty steady at around 30%. And big surprise, because people of color are disproportionately more likely to be tenants than homeowners. Their unemployment rates were higher, big surprise, higher, but even more higher because of the unemployment rate among tenants. So I'd say the executive orders, we were ahead of the game. I'd say right now we're either even or behind the game. And in terms of the disparities between home ownership and rentals, I'd say we're behind the game.
Thank you.
Sherilyn, I see your question in the chat. Maybe I'll touch on this one because it's a lot, it's kind of in my purview. I would say that the commodification of housing has actually always been a problem. It's just for who, and it's you're really looking like all the way back to, well, first we were just taking the land, from people. And so like that is its own type of, a major problem with commodification of property is that it rests on this principle that the property was stolen in the first place. And then what I would say happened is really around the Great Depression. That's when a lot of like first substantial US housing policy started getting written, was kind of not between 1912 and the 1930s. And it was all about stabilizing the workforce. It didn't really have to do with housing. And the widespread subsidies that started flooding through our economy predominantly went to white Americans, and then we basically created a middle class in this country from nothing by subsidizing the creation of housing as a commodity for workers. And so I think what we're seeing right now is in the 70s and 80s, a lot of that deeper subsidy was pulled. And so you have a poor white working class that wasn't able to achieve middle class home ownership. And then you have those policies that never ever benefited people of color really showing their teeth. Those subsidies were pulled across the board, and at the same time wages started stagnating in the 80s. And so we've gotten into this situation where housing has become more expensive to construct. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that it doesn't really matter why it's more expensive to construct, but what really matters is that wages haven't gone up, but the cost of housing has. And so it's just visible now to many like middle class people, but it's always been a problem in this country. It's just, you have to look at it through that historic lens, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that's a really good point, Ben, that if you go back in the 1800s, it was more likely to have a wealthy class and a poor class, right? And then what happened more in the 1900s is there was kind of a creation of a kind of white middle class, and through the programs that you mentioned and through essentially redlining them away from people.
I started reading a little bit about ejidos in Mexico, which is a type of communal land holding. And I was just wondering if any of you guys have studied that and could say a few words about that.
I have not studied that. Have you, Ben?
I haven't studied that in particular, but we have done a lot of research into land trusts, and that's a really similar concept. That's something that's been going on since maybe the 1960s and earlier, and actually Black farmers were some of the first people who did land trusts, where it's kind of, sort of like cooperative housing now as we understand it, as people coming together to put land into a trust. And that's actually something that in the housing justice program, we have started asking that question of, in St. Paul, how can we expand land trusts and cooperative housing as a way to make housing more affordable for people, but it flies in the face of housing as a commodity because you're making it more accessible for more people. So I think that's kind of what happens there. I have one final question, and maybe we could.
I'll just add one thing to that. In Minneapolis, there's a project right now in our Housing Justice Center is involved with that. I put something in the link about it. It's called TOPA.
TOPA. Yep.
Yeah, and that's a process to help tenants become owners of their places. And we've seen land trusts more in the environmental world, and I really like what you said, Sherilyn, about thinking of that more in the residential housing world.
So my last question is, I think as someone who's on the ground, who's working with a lot of these folks who are experiencing evictions, I get so caught up in what are the immediate policies that we can change. But it strikes me when I talk to both of you that where the ground is and where tenants are and where the world of housing law is are very different places. So I was wondering if maybe you could both speak to, what does the future of U.S. housing policy law look like in this country when we have this system that is obviously not really working?
Well, to make big strides in that, we need a different government in Washington. And frankly, we need a different government in Minnesota. I do lobbying on behalf of tenants, and a lot of that goes great in the House and gets killed in the Senate. There's a lot of that going on nationally as well. So we need kind of an electoral shift that prioritizes housing. The issue of housing affordability is really not that complicated from an economic standpoint. If you're having trouble affording, let's say here's your income, you're having trouble affording your rent because they're really close, you need to make more money, and your housing needs to be cheaper, right? And so things like minimum wage and different types of benefit programs to help people raise that income, and different types of housing subsidies, land trusts, TOPA, things like that, to bring the cost down. Now, I'm not so naive to say that there are no losers when you do things like that, because when you raise minimum wage, there are some businesses are going to be impacted, and it may affect pricing, which also can come back to consumers. But when I balance out the benefits and harms, I think increasing minimum wage is a good thing. And same thing with things like rent control. So we have rent control in St. Paul, and something may come up in Minneapolis. There are losers in that too, right? Some smaller landlords that want to increase their rents, they need to have some ability to do that. I'd say the bigger landlords and the multi-state corporations, them losing a little bit in their profit, I think is a small harm for making housing more affordable. And in making home ownership more of a really not a redlined opportunity for white folks, I'd say those are kind of the three things that I think could potentially change the landscape.
And I think on the local level, speaking to people on the ground, right now it's a really important time to be active, to be involved, to advocate, even with liberal governments, give or take, in St. Paul and Minneapolis. There are policies, there are differences between strong rent control policy in St. Paul and a weak rent control policy in St. Paul. So making sure, even though there's this important electoral victory in the fall, to make sure that your voice is heard, that you want a strong policy. This is something that was voted on. This is something that has popular support, and is something that you don't want, polluted by corporate interests. Similarly, TOPA is going to go up in Minneapolis, the tenant opportunity to purchase that Larry mentioned, as well as rent control. And again, advocating for a strong rent control policy there, advocating for TOPA. A concrete example is the difference between a TOPA policy that covers, and again, TOPA really good for creating, tenant ownership and the kind of cooperative structure that Sherilyn brought up, that she was reading about, and can really empower tenants and build wealth that way. And there's a really big difference between, a version of TOPA that some people on the city council want to pass that would cover 18%, and the one that would actually benefit tenants, which is something that would cover much, much more than just 1 in every 5 properties.
Well, thank you so much both for presenting. Any final thoughts from anyone, and then we'll end for the night?
I wonder if the slideshows that Larry and Max shared with us, if those are resources that we might be able to put on our website, so people can follow up easily and find them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yep, if you go to my website, where is it here? Yeah, so if you go to that page here, again, if you selected rent help, it would take you right down to Max's slideshow. And if you selected tenants and landlords, that would take you right down to my slideshow. And we update these things now and then.
Great.
And again, it's just povertylaw.homestead.com, but and you've got the link as well. So feel free to download anything from this page and put it wherever you want.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for presenting, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
All right.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Bye.
Thank you.